everyone, my name is Allie and welcome to my channel. Today is a kind of continuation of last month's wrap-up and also sort of the beginning of this month's wrap-up. As you can probably tell from the title of this video, it was Latine Heritage Month from September 15th to October 15th. And because the month kind of starts in the middle of one month and ends in the middle of the next month, it's kind of a little difficult or confusing to figure out how to do a wrap-up for the books that I've read for this Heritage Month. So I figured I would just do like a dedicated wrap-up video and talk about all of the Latine books that I read for Latine Heritage Month. I ended up reading 8 books by Latine authors and I'm really excited to talk about these with you guys. Let's just start off on the first book that I ended up reading for Latine Heritage Month, and that was I'll Give You a Reason, Stories by Anel Lopez. And this was just a pretty basic story collection. Reading this book actually helped me realize that I really prefer story collections that are like horror or horror adjacent or some sort of like speculative fiction. While the stories in this collection were definitely like objectively good, they just didn't really work for me and they weren't something that was in my particular taste. So unfortunately this book just didn't work for me, but it is just really a collection of different fictional short stories told from the perspective of the Latine experience. The next book that I ended up reading was Craft, Stories I Wrote for the Devil by Ananda Lima. And this one had a lot of promise for me in the beginning. Basically, this book is kind of like a short story collection, but it's really framed by the fact that like it's following this main character who is also a writer who at a party in the late 90s met the devil, and these short stories are kind of the product of that meeting with the devil. And from that premise I was like, oh, that's really intriguing. I really liked the very beginning of this book. However, I felt that as it went on, it just never really hit in the way that I was hoping for it to. And while I really appreciated a lot of like the different and speculative aspects of the stories in this book, it just never really pushed it far enough. Like I wanted it to go a little bit more weird, a little bit more surreal in a way. And I also just felt like for being a story collection or just being a book that emphasizes so much about these being stories for the devil, it just didn't really feel like it had any sort of connection to the devil as like a character or as like a thematic storytelling tool. It just didn't really work for me. I didn't really see the connection there. So again, I feel like, you know, objectively this would probably work for a lot of people, but for what I was personally looking for, it just really fell flat and wasn't as exciting or impressive as I was hoping for it to be. After those two semi-disappointing reads, I was like, you know what? I need a Silvia Moreno Garcia book to read. I need one so bad. And I hadn't picked up Certain Dark Things yet. If you know me, you know I've read the majority of her backlist. I love her book so much. She's one of my favorite authors of all time, but I just hadn't gotten to this book yet. So I was like, you know what? Now is the perfect time as any. And I'd heard so many good things about it that I was really excited to pick it up, and thankfully it did not disappoint. I ended up giving this book a 4 out of 5 stars and I really enjoyed it. And this book basically takes place in Mexico City and follows a vampire named Otto, and she's a descendant of a very long line of Aztec vampires. And she's always just kind of been on her own. I believe that most of her family is now dead. And so she just kind of, you know, goes out into the world on her own, does her own thing, and she ends up running into this one human, and he is very intrigued by her. He has heard a lot of stories about vampires and he kind of just wants to know more about her. And she's just like not really feeling it. Like she's like, please leave me alone. But he ends up kind of charming his way into her life, and they just kind of end up going on this adventure trying to get away from this narco vampire clan. And there's just like a lot of really interesting vampire human politics, and there's like an entire police force dedicated to finding vampires and stuff like that. So it's really intriguing. I love the way that Silvia Moreno Garcia like almost always sets a lot of her stories in Mexico City. I think it's really intriguing. I've never personally been, but I would love to go, and mainly because of these books. I know most of the books that she uses Mexico City as a backdrop are very supernatural, very like action adventure driven, but she just really has a way of setting the scene so beautifully and really using the setting to her advantage. I feel like in all of her books, and this one is no exception, like she uses the setting of Mexico City almost as its own character, and I think that that adds a really interesting perspective to her books. Overall, definitely a really great book, really solid. The reason I only gave it 4 out of 5 stars is mainly because I just felt like I didn't have a sort of like emotional reaction to this book that I sometimes do with her other books. But this one was just a really fun and enjoyable read, and I highly recommend it. The next book that I ended up reading was admittedly pretty forgettable, and that was Bonsai by Alejandra Zambra. And even in my Goodreads review, I said just kind of blah, never really grabbed my attention. And that's really true. Like, I felt like this book was kind of objectively well written, but it just really lacked substance for me, and I felt like a lot of the story was kind of propped up by a lot of name dropping and pretentiousness and stuff like that. Like, I feel like the characters were just constantly name dropping pretentious books and authors and poetry, you know, stuff like that, and it never really felt like it had the substance of character development, plot, storyline, anything like that. It just felt like it was a vehicle to be like, I'm really smart and I've read a lot. And so that didn't really work for me personally, and from reading a lot of the reviews, it seems like it didn't work for a lot of other people as well. And from the description, I was hoping for it to be a really like deep and interesting look at the lives of these 2 young people as they fall in love and they're in school and things like that. But like I said, it just really ended up being a way for the author to kind of flaunt how many books that they've read in order to make them seem deeper than they are. So unfortunately, that book just didn't work out for me. I should also mention that this is a translated work, and the translator was Carolina de Robertis. The next book was another one that unfortunately let me down, even though I think that this had the potential to be one of my favorite books, and that was Sammy Espinosa's Last Review by Taylor K. Mejia. And I was so excited when I started this book, and I felt like it had so much potential. This is an adult romance, and this follows a young woman, and she is a music reviewer, and at the beginning of this book, she has made a really unfortunate decision and has kind of used her music review to get back at one of her exes, and she is getting threatened with losing her job. And so in order to keep her job, she has promised her boss that she's gonna get the inside scoop on the newest album from a former boy band member. And so this entire book is just kind of like her trying to get back into her boss's good graces, trying to get this interview, trying to get the inside scoop. And she ends up going to kind of her hometown, where also this ex-boy band member is from as well. And their paths cross, and they kind of start to get into this friendship and relationship, and obviously romantic things occur. The things that I really loved about this book were the main character. I absolutely loved her. I thought she was really interesting, very distinctly complex, and obviously didn't always make the right decisions, and I thought that that was really interesting and kind of refreshing, especially in a romance novel where I feel like more often than not the main character is usually making pretty sound decisions, or at least like the best possible decisions that they could make. However, with this main character, I felt like she was making some of the worst decisions ever. I'm like, why would you do that? But it also made for a really funny and interesting reading experience. The thing I really didn't like was the love interest. I felt like he was really flat, very much like a one-dimensional character. Didn't really have any discernible personality to him. I just was very bored anytime she was in his company. And I felt like this book would have been one of my favorite books of the year if it hadn't been a romance. I really wish that this book had been like a literary fiction coming of age novel about this very troubled and complex young woman and her just like figuring out her life and going through these trials and not ending up with the guy at the end. I just felt like because it's a romance novel, she was basically forced to be with this guy at the end, and he was so boring and so just very blah. I feel like there's no better word to use than just blah. He was horrible, like it's just awful. And not even because he was like a bad person or anything, like he was totally fine in that aspect. He wasn't problematic. It was just like he was so boring. He was just so freaking boring. And also I have to say something I kind of forgot that now I'm rereading my review, I remember. In my review I said this one was just too ridiculously sad in the most hyperbolic ways possible, and I felt like in this book, for some reason, the author just kept throwing and piling on these horrible things that were happening to this character for no good reason. I felt like if you're going to make a romance book, we gotta limit some of the shitty things that are happening to this character. Like, please, I'm begging you. Sure, have a couple of bad, like maybe 2 or 3 bad things happen. I totally understand. Plot-wise, it's gotta be interesting. I get it. But this character, I like reading from the list of things that I compiled that happened to her. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Like 7 things. Like that's too many things. That's too many, and they're all horrible. Like they're all worst case possible, worst case scenario. Multiple members of her family are dead or are dying or do die in this book. She has an absentee mother, her job's on the line, her love interest is a wet cardboard cutout. Like, it's too much. It's too much for one character to go through in one book. It does not need to be that serious. And nothing ever really is. Like, I get it. Bad things happen in real life, but I feel like if you're writing a romance novel, we gotta cut it back a little bit, just a little. Like, you don't need to throw everything at her. Like, not every bad thing that you can think of needs to happen to your main character. Didn't really work for me as a romance novel. I felt like it could have been better if it was a literary fiction novel. Okay, now on to one of my favorite books, not only of the Latine Heritage Month, but also of the year. I love this book so much. I very nearly want to drop everything and reread it. And that is Oye by Melissa Mogollon. And I loved this book so much. I can't express enough how incredible this book was. And I truly was not expecting for it to be that good, mainly because I had a horrible track record this month. Just so many books were not working for me, and I was like, you know what, this might be next. And B, once I started it, I realized that this book is told only through dialogue and only through like a phone conversation or multiple phone conversations. And so I was a little concerned. And C, this is from the perspective of, I believe she's 17 years old. I might be wrong about that, but I'm pretty sure she's 17. I don't know if this is technically categorized as YA, even though the main character is a teenager, but I'm pretty sure that on Goodreads it's categorized as adult. So don't take my word for it. I'm not quite sure, but I found it in the adult section. That's all I'm gonna say. But basically this follows a teenager. She's in high school. She lives in Florida, and she lives in a household with her mom and dad and her grandma. She does have an older sister, but her older sister is off at college, and her older sister is the one that is receiving all of these phone calls. And this basically just really goes through the life and times of this teenage girl and her close relationship with her grandma, her tumultuous relationship with her mom, and just kind of like all of these family dynamics coming together. all through the perspective of this teenage girl, and I loved it so much. The main character's voice is so distinct and so interesting. I could have read like a 700-page book just from her perspective. She was so funny and so authentically a teenager. Like, she reminded me so much of myself at that age, of like just being really snarky and like just feeling like you're like the most clear-headed person in your entire family, even if you're not. I really loved her. I really felt for her. I really felt like I knew her, and this author was able to craft her voice in such a distinct way. I loved it. It made her really jump right off the page. And honestly, this might be one of the funniest books that I've read all year. It was so I highly recommend it. I will say, content warning for cancer, doctors, stuff like that, but I really love this book. I feel like I don't hear enough people talking about it. On Goodreads, it says that there's only less than 2,000 ratings and only 607 reviews. Like, more people need to be reading this book. It is so good. I highly recommend it. And I feel like if you're going to read any of the books that I've talked about in this video, it's gotta be Oye, so highly recommend it. The next book that I read was actually the only one that I own physically, and that was Velvet Was the Night by Silvia Moreno Garcia. And like I said, I didn't have a lot of books to choose from this time around, unfortunately. So I had to double up on the Silvia Moreno Garcia. I try not to do that every year because I like to space out the books that I read from her, because honestly, like, the backlist is dwindling at this point. I don't have very many other books left from her, so I was really hesitant to pick this up, but I was like, you know what, you're running out of options, just pick it up. So I ended up reading this one, and I also gave it a 4 out of 5 stars. And this is a historical noir, which I honestly have never read that genre or subgenre before, so this was definitely a new experience for me, but it didn't make it any less enjoyable. In my review, I said, I love the way Silvia Moreno Garcia is always able to weave important social and historical events from Mexico into these engaging narratives with characters that pop right off the page. I think that that perfectly encapsulates my feelings about this book. On the inside cover it says, 1970s Mexico City, Maite is a secretary who lives for one thing, the latest issue of Secret Romance. While student protests and political unrest consume the city, Maite escapes into stories of passion and danger. Her next-door neighbor, Leonora, a beautiful art student, seems to live a life of intrigue and romance that Maite envies. When Leonora disappears under suspicious circumstances, Maite finds herself searching for the missing woman and journeying deeper into Leonora's secret life of student radicals and dissidents. Meanwhile, someone else is also looking for Leonora at the behest of his boss, a shadowy figure who commands goon squads dedicated to squashing political activists. Elvis is an eccentric criminal who longs to escape his own life. He loathes violence and loves old movies and rock and roll. But as Elvis searches for a missing woman, he watches Maite from a distance and regards her as a kindred spirit who shares his love of music and the unspoken loneliness of his heart. Now as Maite and Elvis come closer to discovering the truth behind Leonora's disappearance, they can no longer escape the danger that threatens to consume their lives, with hitmen, government agents, and Russian spies all aiming to protect Leonora's secrets at gunpoint. And like I said, I just think that this does a really great job at weaving together historical moments and things in history that are not super familiar to me, and weaving them into a really intriguing narrative with characters that honestly jump right off the page. I think that that's something that Silvia Moreno Garcia does so beautifully, is characterization. All of her characters feel so distinct and so interesting and complex and like real breathing humans, which I love that. And yeah, I feel like there's not really much more I can say about this book that I haven't already said. For certain dark things about how much I love Silvia Moreno Garcia's writing. It's just so beautiful. It's very atmospheric. It's very much like you can jump right into the page, and she really takes me on journeys that I never would have thought I would go on before. Never before have I ever felt like I was going to reach for a historical noir book, but if Silvia Moreno Garcia writes it, I will read it. And the very last book that I read for Latine Heritage Month was Blackouts by Justin Torres. And I ended up giving this book a 4 out of 5 stars. This is one that I was not expecting to like, but I decided to pick it up last minute and I was like, you know what, let's just give it a shot. And I'm so glad that I did because I really enjoyed this one. This is basically a story about 2 gay men. One of them is young and one of them is on his deathbed. And these 2 characters have known each other and been friends for a while. And as the older man lays dying, they both decide to trade stories between one another. And that's basically the entire premise of this book. It's like a really inventive mix of a semi-fictional, semi-historical narrative that I really love. And it deals with queer history in a way that feels very immediate and very poignant. And a lot of it is inspired by the book Sex Variants, A Study of Homosexual Patterns, which contains stories and research from Jan Gay. And this is kind of a response to the fact that Jan Gay has kind of been struck from the narrative of like this actual book. And so I just found it to be really intriguing and definitely a way of like re-controlling the narrative through a queer lens, which I really liked. I will say that this book can at times be very narratively incoherent, but I think that that's mainly because one of the narrators is dying, obviously, so it can kind of be a little bit hard to follow at times. But overall, I really enjoyed this book. It was very moving, it was very emotional, and also very educational, which I really liked. So I highly recommend it if you're looking for queer Latine fiction. This just was so beautifully written, so heartfelt, and I just really enjoyed it. Okay, so those were all the books that I read for Latine Heritage Month. Like I said, a lot of trials and tribulations. The books that I read were kind of like a mixed bag. Some of them I really liked, others I just found to be either meh or I didn't really like them, but so is life and so is the art of reading. Let me know what books that you read for Latine Heritage Month. Let me know if there are any Latine books that I should pick up. I'm always looking for them. I read them throughout the year, every year. And yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed this video. I hope you guys enjoyed getting to hear all of my thoughts on these books. And if you did, go ahead and give it a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel. Also, go ahead and follow me on Instagram, Twitter, Goodreads, Storygraph, TikTok. All the links are down below, and I will talk to you all in my next video. Bye!